Welcome back to our channel, where we dive deep into the glamorous, unpredictable, and often treacherous world of daytime television. Today is a magnificent day to unpack some of the most earth-shattering and monumental developments we have ever witnessed in the sprawling landscape of Los Angeles. The drama is reaching a fever pitch, so let us step right into the heart of the action and explore the explosive shifting of power. The atmosphere inside the main executive office of Forrester Creations was thick enough to cut with a knife, radiating a palpable sense of impending doom that seemed to seep from the very walls of the legendary fashion house. This was not merely another routine gathering of executives to discuss quarterly margins or upcoming seasonal lines. This was an emergency summons initiated by the ultimate patriarch, Eric Forrester, and his son, Ridge Forrester. The suddenness of the meeting had sent shockwaves through the corridors of the building, prompting senior staff members to file into the grand boardroom with hushed whispers and anxious glances. The heavy mahogany table, which had served as the battleground for decades of family feuds, corporate takeovers, and creative triumphs, now felt like an executioner's block. The portraits of past collections and the lingering ghosts of the company's storied history seemed to look down upon the gathering, anticipating a seismic shift that would forever alter the trajectory of the Forrester empire. Sitting at the head of the table, Eric Forrester possessed a demeanor of profound, unshakable gravity. The man who had built this global fashion dynasty from the ground up looked both weary and resolutely determined. For weeks, Eric had been quietly observing the alarming deterioration of the company's internal culture, watching with growing dismay as the legacy he had painstakingly crafted was overshadowed by petty vindictiveness and unchecked arrogance. Beside him sat Ridge, a man visibly torn apart by the agonizing conflict raging within his soul. Ridge had always been the ultimate defender of his children, the fierce protector who would go to the ends of the earth to shield his daughter, Steffy Forrester Finnegan, from any perceived threat. Yet, as the senior staff took their seats, the grim, sorrowful expression etched into Ridge's features signaled that his unwavering protection had finally reached its absolute limit. When Steffi entered the room, she carried herself with the signature haughty confidence that had come to define her recent tenure as co-CEO. Wrapped in her executive hubris, she took her seat with an air of untouchable authority, completely oblivious to the catastrophic guillotine that was suspended mere inches above her neck. She had spent the last several weeks ruling with an iron fist, condescendingly dismissing the concerns of her peers, aggressively pausing the hope for the future line to prioritize couture, and blatantly ignoring the desperate, prophetic warnings delivered by Carter Walton. In her mind, she was the undisputed queen of Forrester Creations, the sole visionary who possessed the necessary ruthless edge to drive the company forward. She looked around the room, perhaps expecting a lecture on unity or a mild reprimand regarding her treatment of Hope Logan Spencer, but she was entirely unprepared for the devastating reality that was about to shatter her world. The room fell into a suffocating, heavy silence as Eric Forrester finally cleared his throat to speak. His voice, though weathered by time, resonated with an undeniable, commanding authority that demanded absolute attention. With a heavy heart, Eric addressed the room, his words carefully measured but cutting with the precision of a scalpel. He announced, to the absolute shock and bewilderment of the gathered senior staff, that Steffi Forrester Finnegan had fundamentally lost the necessary composure, emotional intelligence, and professional objectivity required to lead the family empire. He spoke of the toxic environment that had festered under her recent leadership, the alienation of key creative talent, and the alarming transformation of her executive persona into something unrecognizable and dangerously erratic. Eric's declaration was not born of malice, but of a desperate, protective love for the company that bore his name, a company that could not survive the destructive path Steffi had charted. The collective gasp that rippled through the boardroom was a visceral testament to the magnitude of Eric's words. Executives exchanged stunned, wide-eyed glances, struggling to process the reality that the patriarch was actively dismantling his own granddaughter's corporate reign in real time. Carter Walton, who had practically begged Steffy and Ridge to change course to avoid a disastrous corporate coup, sat in quiet, somber vindication, realizing that his darkest prophecies had materialized faster than he could have ever anticipated. Hope Logan, who had been pushed to the absolute brink of defection and had actively orchestrated this revolution behind the scenes, watched with bated breath, witnessing the monumental consequences of her relentless push for justice and respect within the company walls. However, the most agonizing moment of the gathering was yet to come. The burden of executing this corporate execution fell squarely upon the shoulders of Ridge Forrester. The room watched in a state of suspended animation as Ridge, his eyes brimming with unshed tears and his hands trembling slightly, slowly reached into his tailored jacket to withdraw an official legal document. The silence was deafening as he placed the paper onto the polished mahogany surface. Ridge spoke, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his paternal grief, acknowledging that while it shattered his heart into a million irreparable pieces, he had to prioritize the survival of Forrester Creations over his blind loyalty to his daughter. He confessed that he had enabled her worst instincts, that he had allowed her arrogance to go unchecked for far too long, and that he could no longer stand by while she actively destroyed the morale and the future of their shared legacy. With a heavy, agonizing sigh, Ridge uncapped his pen and leaned forward. The scratching sound of the ink permanently binding to the paper echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. In that single definitive stroke, Ridge officially signed the executive order to immediately revoke Steffy's rights, privileges, and title as the co-CEO of Forrester Creations. The physical act of signing the document represented a profound, devastating betrayal in the eyes of his daughter. But to Ridge, it was the tragic, necessary amputation of a diseased limb to save the life of the patient. He had finally recognized the monster he had allowed Steffy to become in the boardroom, and he was taking the ultimate, excruciating step to neutralize the threat she posed to everything they had built. But the vacuum of power at the absolute pinnacle of the fashion industry could not remain empty for even a fraction of a second. The company needed a stabilizing force, a leader who commanded respect, possessed an intimate understanding of the brand's history, and could immediately heal the deep fractures caused by Steffy's reign of terror. Ridge, looking up from the signed document, his gaze shifting across the room, delivered the final, cataclysmic blow. He announced that the newly vacated co-CEO position, along with all its attendant power, authority, and creative control, was being officially transferred to Brooke Logan. The pronouncement struck the room with the force of a localized earthquake, fundamentally rewriting the power dynamics of the entire Los Angeles fashion world in a matter of syllables. Brooke Logan, who had been marginalized, disrespected, and repeatedly pushed aside by Steffy's condescending leadership, sat momentarily frozen as the reality of her ascension washed over her. This was the culmination of weeks of intense internal conflict, the direct result of her daughter, Hope, pushing her to fight for her rightful place, to stop accepting the scraps thrown to her by a younger generation that had forgotten her foundational contributions to the empire. As Brooke slowly absorbed the magnitude of the moment, a profound sense of vindication settled into her posture. She was no longer just the matriarch's rival or the CEO's wife. She was now the supreme co-ruler of Forrester Creations, sitting on the very throne that Stephanie Forrester had once occupied, placed there by the hands of Eric and Ridge themselves. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, Steffi remained absolutely motionless, her mind desperately attempting to reject the catastrophic reality unfolding before her eyes. Then, the shock shattered, giving way to a volatile, volcanic eruption of raw, unadulterated fury. Steffi shot up from her leather chair, her hands slamming violently onto the table as tears of rage, humiliation, and profound betrayal streamed down her face. She screamed, her voice tearing through the refined elegance of the boardroom, a primal sound of a wounded animal cornered by its own family. The composed, untouchable executive facade completely disintegrated, leaving behind a desperately heartbroken and fiercely angry woman who felt she had been publicly executed by the men she trusted most in the world. Through her hysterical tears, Steffi launched a blistering, venomous verbal assault directly at her father. She pointed a trembling finger at Ridge, her voice dripping with absolute disgust as she accused him of being entirely bewitched by Brooke Logan. She screamed that Ridge was not thinking with the strategic mind of a CEO, but was instead entirely manipulated by his enduring, toxic obsession with his wife. Steffi painted a narrative of a weak, compromised father who had willingly sacrificed his own flesh and blood, his own daughter, simply to appease the relentless, power-hungry ambitions of the Logan women. In Steffi's eyes, this was not a business decision based on her performance. This was the ultimate victory in the decades-long Forster-Logan War, and Ridge had just handed the enemy the keys to the castle. The psychological wound inflicted in that moment cut deeper than any corporate demotion ever could. Steffi looked at her father, the man who had always been her ultimate safety net, and saw only a traitor who had chosen his wife over his child. She accused him of destroying her life's work, of invalidating every sacrifice she had ever made for the company, and of allowing Brooke to finally achieve her ultimate goal of entirely erasing the true Forster lineage from the seat of power. The venom in her words was matched only by the profound, agonizing pain in her eyes, a pain that Ridge absorbed with every flinch, knowing that he was the architect of her devastation. Wiping the tears from her flushed cheeks, Steffi's hysterical screaming slowly morphed into a chilling, calculated, and terrifyingly calm vow of vengeance. She stared directly into the eyes of Eric, Ridge, and finally, Brooke, her gaze burning with an inextinguishable destructive fire. She promised them, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that she would not simply pack her belongings and walk quietly into the night. She swore that she would not allow Brooke Logan to comfortably sit in her chair without a fight that would shake the very foundations of Los Angeles. Steffi declared that they had just awakened a sleeping dragon, and that her retaliation would be swift, merciless, and utterly devastating to anyone who stood in her way. As she prepared to storm out of the boardroom, Steffi delivered one final, haunting warning that hung in the air long after she had turned her back. She looked at her father one last time and stated that this singular, treacherous act marked the definitive, irreversible end of the Forster family unity. There would be no holiday gatherings, no peaceful family dinners, no reconciliation behind closed doors. The family was now fundamentally and permanently fractured, divided into warring factions that would stop at nothing to annihilate one another. With that chilling prophecy, Steffi turned on her heel and marched out of the office, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind her with a resounding thud that echoed like a judge's gavel finalizing a life sentence. The silence that followed her departure was suffocating, heavy with the realization of the catastrophic damage that had just been inflicted. The event had instantly created an irreparable, gaping chasm between Ridge and his daughter, a wound so deep and so deeply personal that it seemed impossible it could ever be healed. Ridge slumped back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, the crushing weight of his decision bearing down upon his shoulders. He had saved the company from Steffi's erratic leadership, but in doing so, he had fundamentally destroyed his relationship with his child, a sacrifice that would haunt his every waking moment for the rest of his life. Simultaneously, the slamming of that door heralded the dawn of a turbulent, highly unpredictable new era under the leadership of Brooke Logan. Brooke now faced the monumental task of steering a massive, global fashion empire that had just been violently ripped from the hands of its former leader. She knew that her ascension would not be universally accepted. There would be loyalists within the building who would view her as an illegitimate usurper. And she would have to fight tooth and nail to prove that she possessed the strategic brilliance and the ruthless edge required to maintain the company's dominance. The immediate reinstatement of the Hope for the Future line was a certainty, but the broader cultural shift within the building would require immense political maneuvering and unwavering strength. Furthermore, Brooke, Ridge, and Eric knew that Steffy's vow of vengeance was not an empty threat. Steffy was a formidable, highly intelligent, and deeply connected businesswoman who possessed the resources and the sheer willpower to launch a devastating counteroffensive. Whether she would attempt to poach key designers, launch a rival fashion house to directly compete with Forrester Creations, or utilize her immense wealth to initiate a hostile takeover of the board, the possibilities for her retaliation were endless and terrifying. The battle lines had been permanently drawn, not just in the corporate ledgers, but in the very bloodlines of the family. As the senior staff slowly and silently filed out of the boardroom, leaving Eric, Ridge, and Brooke alone in the aftermath of the explosion, the true gravity of the situation settled over them. They had crossed the Rubicon. The landscape of their lives, their business, and their family had been permanently altered in the span of a single hour. The Forrester empire was no longer a united front facing the challenges of the fashion world. It was a deeply divided, heavily fortified battleground where the most dangerous enemies were the ones who shared the same last name. The war for the soul of Forrester Creations had officially begun, and the